Welcome to the Korea Pro podcast. I'm your host, Jeongmin Kim, the editorial director of Korea Pro.
And I'm John Lee, the editor of Korea Pro.
Join us for a weekly 15-minute conversation as we dive into the most pressing stories shaping South Korea and dissect the most complicated ones for you.
From politics to culture, technology to society, we've got you covered. So stay ahead of the curve and never be sidelined again.
So get ready for a fresh perspective on South Korea's news. This is the Korea Pro podcast. We're recording Thursday, July 4th. Happy Independence Day, America. And we are joined today for a special episode. Dr. David Kang, he is a professor of international relations at the University of Southern California, also director of the U.S. Korean Studies Institute. Thank you so much for joining us on your vacation.
It's delightful to be here.
And today I'm also joined by co-host John Lee today.
Yay. I'm just happy to be here.
Well, this discussion, the idea about a special episode about U.S. South Korea relations and the politics as well, it sort of started off with a very interesting Twitter or X thread by Dr. Kang, but it actually fits the timing right now because there are a lot of talks right now in South Korea about the future of U.S. South Korea alliance, especially after the first U.S. presidential debate recently. And also in South Korea, too, we are looking ahead, like after the next 3 years or so, we will see a presidential election as well. And we have also a pending PPP, People's Power Party leadership race in South Korea. So a lot going on right now. And just to start with, can you please briefly explain the context of the threat that I just mentioned regarding U.S. South Korea relations and the perceived preference of the DC blob regarding, what do you like more, conservative or progressive partners in Asia sort of
And if you could also give a quick recap of the thread that you wrote.
Well, I say a lot of things, so forgive me if I don't remember exactly what I said.
I have it in front of me right now.
But the prompt about the DC blob and preferring conservatives is absolutely true, right? Which is that Americans, we claim to love democracy.
Until it's not convenient.
Yeah, until elections take the whatever local partner away from very pro-U.S. stance. And then we talk about amateur hour and roll our eyes and can't wait till the real serious adults in the room get voted back in.
That takes me back to the George W. Bush years.
Oh, ever since I was in the 80s, you know what I mean? Like, before democracy, there was this discussion of how much we always prefer this. And if we actually let full democracy in, then they'll be pro-North Korea and things like that. And so, yeah, there is a blob, there is a DC blob, there is a conventional wisdom, and we can talk about it, but it's everybody coalesces around things that will keep them power in the U.S. from left and right.
Of course.
And so it doesn't matter what the reality is on the ground in, say, South Korea. What they want is stability, pro-U.S. stance, and an ironclad relationship. And there are two problems with it. The first one, and I say this a lot, is I say the more that Americans have performatively gone around the world claiming to support democracy, like Pelosi's visited Taiwan 2 years ago. Right? She left Singapore, which isn't a democracy, and then flew to Taiwan and said, democracy, yay! Putting Taiwan in real trouble in many ways, right? I mean, this is not necessarily something we want to do. So we claim that we love democracy, and we do. But then, I say this all the time, elections have consequences. The political pendulum swings. And real democracy is going to have people voting in sometimes that aren't interests that aren't necessarily compatible with the United States. And I say even conservative Koreans, like the Yoon Suk-yeol administration, has some, but not all of American interests.
Exactly.
The Yoon government is going to be more open to dealing with China than Americans are. You have to live with China. It's right there. Right? So even conservative governments are going to have a different viewpoint on the world than what we want.
Well, it's good to mention that part because I was going to bring in something newer in South Korean headlines right now. You mentioned that even conservative administrations or conservative politicians, they don't exactly align all the time with the U.S. interests, right? And there's a prime example for that just from last week. Conservative politicians in South Korea, they reignited the talks about nuclear arming South Korea, despite, this is quite ironic because it came on the heels of the show of force from the U.S. by sending the U.S. aircraft carrier that same morning. It was a Korean War anniversary. And they started talking about nuclear armament again. And this is despite in the past year.
All three leading candidates.
Right. And this is despite the U.S. building stuff like nuclear consultative groups to give Yoon administration something that sounds more nuclear and, the extended deterrence bolstering and more voice for South Korea, so on and so forth. So how do you explain this conservative nationalist recent reigniting of this nuclear armament debate in line with your
Well, that's
argument?
actually similar, right? Because Korean politicians are going to be concerned with Korean issues, and this is an ongoing discussion. Now, I tend to think South Korea is not going to go nuclear for a number of reasons. We can talk about that later. But this discussion is going on, and no matter what kind of bone we tossed or flower we tossed at Korea last spring,
Titled
doesn't
nuclear.
mean, yes. I mean, this is the thing also about any country, but particularly democracies. You can't say we'll never talk about it again. Of course it's coming up, right? And of course it'll be
And
an
you can't
issue.
force them to not talk about
No,
it.
right? And so Americans saying, how dare you, is just an example of, in some ways, I think, in many ways, the arrogance of an American viewpoint, which is, of course, all the countries who are somewhat on our side should line up totally with us.
But is there anyone in America who's actually saying how dare you to South Korea at this point?
Well, at this point, let me finish one other thing. The other thing I want to point about left and right and the way the political pendulum swings is that measurably, often the liberal governments are the ones that are doing an awful lot, as much or more, to try and have a strong U.S. alliance. And to even frame it as leftist governments are anti-American or pro-North is completely wrong. You go back to Roh Moo-hyun, who got the free trade agreement signed, who sent more troops to Iraq than any other country than the UK, because they share those values or those beliefs with the United States. But to frame it as leftist governments or appeasers of all this political point scoring overshadows or hides how much the Moon administration was doing to have strong relations with the U.S. And then how often the conservative administrations are able to get away with more stuff because they're considered to be more pro-U.S. But the reality is very different on both sides.
Now, I do want to push back on that a little bit. The way that you're framing it right now is South Korea-U.S. relations, just these two countries. But as you are well aware, things in East Asia is changing rapidly. Now, because of the tensions between Beijing and Washington, the U.S. wants a trilateral partnership with Washington, Tokyo, and Seoul. And if the progressives have been in charge, there's a lot of bad blood, and they've said a lot of things that would really annoy Tokyo and would never have led to this sort of trilateral partnership that we're seeing right now. So why wouldn't the Washington blob prefer South Korean conservatives?
Yeah. No, I think that's actually a good point, right? And what'll be interesting to see is how long, what is, I think most of the opinion polls show that Yoon's agreement with the land deal, right at the beginning, and these kinds of things are deeply unpopular, as I understand it.
They are.
Right? And so, yes, you can have an elite that is able to do that, but how enduring is it when the vast majority, 60% are opposed, I think, right? This isn't like margins. This is very deeply unpopular. So, yes, the sort of a third of the country is totally for these kinds of moves that absolve in many ways Japan from having to do anything, but the rest of the country isn't. So in many ways, I'm not sure how enduring that is anyway, right?
What was your previous point about, is there anybody in the U.S.?
Is there anybody in the U.S. actually saying, how dare you to South Korea?
Well,
with these,
I mean, we can
recent-
go find cases, right? I mean, Hillary Clinton accusing South Koreans of having historical amnesia because of what the U.S. did for Korea a long time ago. So how dare you actually ask questions now? I don't think anybody's saying that right now, but that doesn't have anything to do with views of Korea. That has to do with the entire Biden administration has bigger fish to fry.
And all politics is local.
Yeah, and so what happened with the Biden administration was very clear, which is he wanted to focus on domestic politics. He clearly had a bunch of issues, not only January 6th and insurrection, but just climate change, all this kind of stuff.
Econ issues as well.
Yes, right? And so he put the most mainstream, conventional foreign policy people in his administration and said, just make it not, just keep it from bothering, keep it status quo. And of course, the world didn't let him do that. Ukraine, Gaza, and even China, which he's tried not to put too much forward leaning on, they had to pull back on being tough on China because they realized it was hurting themselves. So even on that, the administration has been trying to just not put any energy there if they don't have to. So Korea is, in many ways, for the administration, as long as it's not going poorly, nobody's going to spend energy rocking a boat on it.
Right, like
So I
both
wanna
Koreas were
circle-
quite deportized, right?
A little bit, but I do want to circle back a little bit. So yes, you did rightfully point out that a lot of these foreign pro-Japan foreign policy stances that Yoon took are deeply unpopular, 60%, as you said. But does that mean that if the pendulum swings and the DP says we don't want to pursue this anymore, then should Washington just give up on this trilateral idea?
Let me put it this way. I think the U.S. will always want to have Korea and Japan getting along better. I mean, they've been trying to do that for years.
For decades.
Yes, decades, right? And so I don't think the U.S. is going to stop pushing that, right? I do think that there are a couple inevitable things that are going to make put limits on that kind of cooperation. One of them is an approach to North Korea. One of them is Korea-Japan relations. I mean, I started to make a list. I should write this up sometime. I started to make a list of the things that the Abe administration did to sort of push back on history. Like they dismantled the history unit in the in the Ministry of Foreign, in the Gaimusho, like 20 or 30 things they took down from the website, various apologies. They're clearly moving back on all that stuff, right? And so, yes, that is an issue that's going to come up, right? So Japan-Korea relations, attitudes towards North Korea, and then particularly attitudes toward China and Taiwan. These are going to be different than the U.S. wants. And I'll give you an example. So I'm gonna name drop now, but I happen to be talking to someone high up in the Yoon administration, and we were talking about the one China policy, because every country has come out and reaffirmed it. Vietnam has reaffirmed it. Philippines, ASEAN, everybody has reaffirmed the one China policy, meaning we're not getting involved in Taiwan. If something happens, we're not doing it.
Drawing the line.
Yeah, right? So I said, what is Korea's position? And this is very much, background off the record, et cetera. But it was like, we made our policy in 1992, and it hasn't changed. We're not going to reaffirm it just because China wants to. So we're not going to just sort of jump and reaffirm it. But the policy remains the same. And in fact, I think the Yoon administration did come out a couple months ago and say, that using bases in a Taiwan contingency was not, they weren't going to let that happen.
And they said that last year that if there's a war, the USFK would have to be focused on North Korea.
That's what I mean, right? That they said very clearly, we're not getting involved in ways that are going to be impactful to a U.S.-Korea-Japan trilateral things. Because, as you said, the region is so much more complicated. And Korea's fight is not over Taiwan the way Americans think every country is going to be involved in that fight.
Let me bring us back to the topic a little bit about U.S. South Korea alliance and the political dynamics in South Korea. So just one more part about nuclear armament issue. So there's this U.S. security dilemma. Like even if you assure South Korea so much that we will protect you. It sometimes does not really happen. So how is this security dilemma different when you're handling conservatives and progressives?
Well, let me point out something that's potentially deeply awkward, right? Which is everybody, I should do this. You guys should do this. It's more your job. But every administration, when somebody comes in, they say, it's the best ever, strongest U.S.-Korea relation ever. It's ironclad.
All the time.
It's ironclad, right?
같이 갑시다.
I know, right? 같이 갑시다. How many times have I heard that in my lifetime? Every couple of years. Right? But this is the fundamental question. Would the U.S. get involved in a war over South Korea if the U.S. homeland was potentially getting nuked?
Barack Obama certainly did not.
We are being exceedingly cautious with Ukraine because the potential conflict is with a nuclear armed power, right? I think the Taiwan issue, the lesson about Taiwan that should be learned is not what China's learning about the Ukraine war. It's what Taiwan should be learning, which is the U.S. is going to be deeply careful about getting involved in a war that is not central to American national survival.
And risking
a nuclear exchange. And I think,
this is
nobody, do you really want to talk about this? If North Korea is as nuclear capable as we think that it is and could hit, God forbid, L.A. No, maybe it stops.
Just in Hawaii, maybe.
Yeah, maybe Hawaii, Seattle. That's fine. But all joking aside, if they could hit the mainland United States somehow with nuclear weapons, would the U.S. get involved in a war with North Korea?
And that's exactly politicians like Hong Junpyo or Da Kyung-won are talking about right
right.
It's
now.
the same point that de Gaulle made decades ago.
Yes.
They're
Which
asking the
we-
same thing
We
brought
have
now.
back.
had this question over, right? Would we trade New York for Berlin, right?
Right.
And the point I say to the South Koreans is, it's fun to talk about nuclear weapons, but I'm not sure that nuclear weapons make South Korea any more safe than it is now. And the reason is, I don't think in many ways nuclear weapons are going to deter North Korea any more than South Korea is able to deter it right now. Right? South Korea can already win a war. If there is a nuclear exchange, South Korea can still win a war with North Korea.
It would be a Pyrrhic victory.
It
but
would be, yes, it would be really awful, but it's going to be awful if any war occurs. So I'm not sure how much more security nuclear weapons give South Korea. It does raise the stakes considerably, though. Do you see what I'm saying? The cost benefit to South Korea, I'm not sure is there. But again, I'm not the one making those arguments. But certainly that is at the bottom of this dilemma of South Korea is at what
Elephant
point?
in the room.
Yes, how much do we really trust the U.S. to defend us if U.S. can be hit by nukes?
Any last comment about nukes?
The only thing that I'll add to that is that, yes, if you're only looking at North and South Korea, yes, South Korea will still eke out a Pyrrhic victory. But it's not just North Korea. It's China right next door. And if there's a war, and the Chinese will never allow the war to conclude to the extent that there will be a reunified Korea eventually. They will try to occupy the northern half of the peninsula.
Agree?
I
Disagree?
wonder about that, right? Because
Yes.
here's what I say, right? I don't think Chinese have any desire to control the northern part of the peninsula. I mean, interestingly enough, there were two superpowers that got involved in the 1950 war and sent hundreds of thousands of troops, right? One of them was gone by 1959. They're like, not my country, we'll see you later. The other superpower is still clinging like grim death to its faces here, right? You know, like they could easily have stayed then. They could easily have intervened in many places. And what I say about North Korea is I don't think it's considered a prize. Right? China doesn't consider it a prize. It's like a Korean, it's not Chinese, it's Korean, right? So I don't think there's any intent for a land grab there. I'm not even sure that they think that there's a problem with a unified Korea. I think the problem would be a unified Korea with nuclear weapons in a strong U.S. alliance and things like that, right? If we're playing out these
And
scenarios.
US not in contact for like Wonsan or something.
Yeah, right. But I've been involved in various of these gaming scenarios over the
Right.
years. And the minute you get more than a couple steps out, it just becomes pure speculation about what China would do if there's a North Korea attacks out of the blue and blah, 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 right? Pure speculation.
Of course.
You know.
All right, let's move on to
Okay.
one of the other recent news, U.S. presidential debate. My apologies.
I don't know anything about American politics, though. I watched the Peninsula.
In relations to South Korea alliance, the first debate between Trump and Biden has occurred, and some Democrats are urging Biden to step down due to his age and whatnot. How might the outcome? It's also pure speculation a little bit, but how might the U.S. presidential election or the process up until then impact the alliance, especially if there's a change in administration?
Yeah. I mean, if Biden wins, clearly I think things will be the same.
Status quo.
Very much status quo. I mean, that's what he's trying to do. Even now, if he wins again, he's not going to focus on foreign policy. He wants to focus on domestic politics. And in a lot of ways, I think that makes a lot of sense, right? Right now, if I look at China, if I look at the United States, both of the problems there, like if I'm Xi Jinping when I wake up, I'm much more concerned about the domestic economy, corruption, pollution, than I am about Taiwan or whatever else.
Precisely.
You know, that doesn't mean it's unimportant, but I think both of them are more focused on domestic politics. the
Priorities.
issues. Yeah, the issues, right? Like, I think the American century or whatever is far more likely to die from suicide than murder. You know what I mean? Like, we're going to do it to ourselves.
I thought it's already happening.
Yeah, I know,
already.
if it is, right? If it is, right? You know. So I think it'll be business as usual to the extent that you can do that.
And if
Well, I mean, Trump is such a wild card. So two things about that. First is, I don't think Trump is going to care that much about foreign policy either. I mean, everything we know is that he has become more extreme in what he's saying he's going to do, and it's mostly going to be focused on like domestic payback. You know, I mean, who knows if he's serious. but the talk about rounding up people and suspending habeas corpus and, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think he's going to do that much to the U.S.-Korea alliance either.
Okay, he's a man of ego.
Yes.
What's driving his ambition personally, which could help us understand his goals?
Besides trying to stay out of prison.
Yeah. No, I mean, we've known him all now for, 8 years, right? We all know that it's a mixture of sort of narcissism and ego and vindictiveness. And so, I think the chance that Kim Jong Un had was a real chance. Trump is probably one of the only presidents who would have even tried to make an agreement and talk to him and stuff like that, right? And everything I know about the Hanoi Summit in 2018 is that Trump is the one who backed away and said, we want it all. We're not going to go small for small. We want it all. And Kim wasn't ready to go there, right? If Trump had made a different choice, we were so, let me just stay on this, right? Which I think that's I think it's a real missed opportunity. It's a tragedy. I know all of the harping by the DC blob about you don't do it this way. But if we had taken Yeongbyon and said we will dismantle Yeongbyon and give up the sanctions aren't working anyway. We can pull some of those back, right? I mean, they're not working anyway. Pull some of it. If we had done that, I know that we were down the line talking to the nuclear labs in Los Alamos and Livermore, to engineers and physicists that you may have to go to North Korea on a years-long, months rotation for years to dismantle. Can you imagine how different the peninsula would be right now if we had 30 or 50 or 100 Americans working in North Korea dismantling Yeongbyon right now?
So is that...
I think that's a missed opportunity.
Do you think something like that would be possible again?
I don't think it's possible anymore.
Why?
No. Because imagine how much political capital Kim Jong Un had to use in Pyongyang. I mean, all of his advisors, I guarantee you, I wasn't there, but he doesn't ask my advice, but, we're saying, it's not going to work. Don't go. You're going to humiliate. You can't trust the Americans.
And he did get humiliated.
And he did get humiliated, right? So he took a chance saying, no, I think this is different. He went back and they're like, I told you. So I don't think he has any appetite. That's why they've now enshrined it in the Constitution and, are calling it's no longer for unification. We're just different countries. I think he said, I tried. And the Americans are the ones that we can't trust. And so I don't think there's any chance for a second Hanoi Summit, no matter what Trump says.
Unlock the full Korea Pro experience by joining our community. Stay informed, stay ahead, and never miss a beat on Korean affairs that matter. Subscribe today and transform the way you understand Korea.
Moving away from North Korea issues, let's say Trump is elected. And South Korea faces a presidential election as well. If scenario, progressive administration in South Korea comes in and there's Trump.
Which likely will happen.
Then what's going to happen with the U.S. South Korea alliance and all the agreements that we signed so far and the cost sharing?
It's not just the NCG. As you said, even if Trump is focused on domestic affairs, he will eventually turn his attention to foreign policy.
Something. His administration will have to be focused on. He'll have an ambassador and a national security advisor.
And he has said repeatedly about how South Korea is taking advantage of America, stealing American jobs, being very unfair, and that South Korea is a rich country and can afford to pay 500% more for defense cost sharing, which the progressives in South Korea would really not be agreeable to, shall we say. So what would that do to the alliance if there's a rock and a hard place coming together?
I mean, my sense is, Trump has talked about this the entire time.
Yes.
He talked about it with Europe. He talked about it with Japan. He talked about it with Korea. And, we'll see how much he will actually push forward on this. You have to pay more. You're not doing your share, right? And in that way, I don't think Korea is going to be isolated.
Because it's not just South Korea.
It's not going to be, exactly. It'll be Korea. It'll be all the allies of the alliances. And it'll be things like Taiwan, right? It's very unclear what his attitude towards Taiwan is because it sort of shifts around between why would we fight over that rock to...
His positions on Ukraine is quite clear, but not on...
Well, something about a laptop.
I know, right? Or Putin or whatever else. That's a different perspective. But on the East Asian ones, it's very interesting to see how he's, I don't know.
How do you imagine that, John?
Yeah.
Trump and, let's say, Lee Jae-myung.
Trump and Lee Jae-myung? Well, it would be very good for the business. Let's put it that way.
Korea Pro will be thriving.
I
Probably
know,
try to
right.
explain a lot of things. Is that it?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Okay, let's move on to one of the other points that you made before. Importance of U.S. supporting democracy in Asia, regardless of whether progressive or conservatives win. South Korea actually is famous now for being a country that once impeached a president.
Yeah.
And can you elaborate on why this principle is actually crucial for the stability of U.S.-South Korea relations?
Well, I mean, that's sort
Supporting
of that's-
democracy regardless of.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting, especially with the impeachment thing, right?
Right. By the way, Yoon impeachment is not happening right now, so people just calm down, please. It's not happening.
Aren't there like 1 million signatures or something?
Yeah, but that's
Yeah, it doesn't
yeah.
count. I know. I mean, this is the thing. And the one thing I like to say about South Korea is I know that there's this big debate over like democratic backsliding and all this kind of stuff, right?
We actually wrote a piece about that.
I think I just saw it, yes.
Yeah.
But the thing that I usually point out is it's okay. We can have a discussion about sort of around the margins, right? Also in the United States. But I'm older than both of you, and I remember flying into Gimpo where there's machine gun nests and soldiers everywhere, right? Martial law. You know, so yes, we should keep pushing forward. We should have, it's a robust debate, but it's a debate among, I think, a fairly healthy range of democracy compared to where in 1987, I remember I was living with my aunt, my kungo, and I was here for like 6 months, and nobody knew if Chun was going to call out the troops and start killing thousands of people. I mean, it seems inevitable now, right? That it wasn't inevitable at the time.
Twitter's going to explode if it happens.
Well, could you imagine in 87? The point being, we have come so far from where it used to be. And an impeachment in many ways shows how healthy the democracy was, that it just kept going on, right? And so in that way, I think, yes, we should pay attention, just like we should in the United States. Some stuff is awful, anti-democratic stuff is going on in the United States, and that we should fight that. But in terms of the alliance, one of the things is that this is one of the cores that will be, whether you're Democratic or Republican, it's a core value and it's a core institution that both of the two sides have that they share. That'll make it a lot easier than, say, other countries that are marginally or whatever, partial democracies.
Speaking of imperfect democracies, let's go back to Trump a little bit and assume that he wins the presidency and he does even a fraction of what he has threatened to do once he becomes president again. How would that impact not just the U.S. South Korea alliance, but the entire U.S.-based world order?
Yeah.
Because in order to, for decades, the U.S. has had this soft power image, saying that we're the democracy, we're the leader of the free world.
Yeah.
But if the U.S. is no longer the beacon of freedom, then what kind of legitimacy would the U.S. be able to claim to, battle against the likes of Beijing or Moscow?
Well, I mean, and this is one of those things that I think in the DC blob, you must say, we're America, we're the beacon of democracy and capitalism and human rights around the world. I mean, you cannot say anything else. People roll their eyes at you like you're,
Backward.
yeah, some tie-dye wearing hippie, And yet in many ways, we just so blithely have always been hypocrites about this. We talk about a rules-based order. I always say I call it an American or a Western order. I don't call it a rules or liberal order because it's not based on principles. It's based on self-interest.
Right.
So the U.S. has never signed the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas.
Right.
And we criticize China for not obeying it. But we don't sign it either because we're not going to do that. International Criminal Court, when our guys are, how dare they, and when the people we don't like. So we are blatantly hypocritical.
Lindsey Graham put it quite nicely.
Yes, right. So, I mean,
We're next, he said.
And there has always been that background, but I think it's cracking even more in many ways, right? And the example that I use all the time when I give talks about East Asia is, I think America, people call me like optimistic, but I'm not. Because I say there's not going to be war doesn't mean I'm optimistic. I think the U.S. is making deeply damaging moves in its general grand strategy towards East Asia. And one of the biggest mistakes we've done, and both left and right are doing this. I'm not trying to be even-handed, but I never thought I would see Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump agree that free trade is bad. And
There is no free trade party
and we
anymore.
are pulling. No, there isn't. This is bedrock American belief at trade and free markets.
Not anymore.
And it's not. And we are pulling back from East Asia, where East Asia is moving forward. China, Japan, Korea talking about free trade. I mean, they've talked about it for a while.
Creating a new dialogue
But
channel.
RCEP, TPP, East Asian countries are moving closer together and trading more. And the U.S. is pulling away. And the 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs is so blatantly self-harming to the United States. So I am deeply disappointed or pessimistic about American grand strategy because it's not democracy and free trade and human rights. It's our side and their side. So,
Well, I might question if there is even a strategy at all at this point.
well, I'm not sure that there is at this point either. And the free trade, the whole pullback on trade and invest and everything else to me is just so. I just read an interview with a Ford CEO who said Chinese EVs are innovating around the world better than we are. We are in danger of only being stuck in the North American market behind 100% tariffs because China's EVs, BYD and everything else is like crushing, they're cheaper and better around the world. So Latin America, Africa, they're buying the Chinese cars because that's good for them. Only in America do we not because we have these protectionist barriers.
But U.S. automobiles just being stuck within North America, that's been going on since the 1970s, no?
And we are worse and worse off for it.
Right, and the America First sort of trade isolationist policy, Trump made it like a catchphrase, and then Biden took it.
Yes.
And it just gave it a different
installed
name.
it. Yeah.
Didn't change anything about it, right?
For our listeners who are not aware of the EV issue, how did that impact South Korean businesses?
It took a long time for those negotiations to take place. Eventually, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS Act, they eventually were able to negotiate with South Korea after 2 years. And finally, South Korean companies were able to get some of the subsidies. But it took a lot of fighting behind closed doors for it to happen.
That sort of put you in a very awkward spot. Tough spot, really.
He was being the very pro-U.S. president, and all of a sudden the U.S. was saying, well, thanks, but here's what we want.
Yep, right.
And by the way, do you want to get closer to Japan in the meanwhile?
Right. I mean, that's the difficulty that Korea has. But yeah, that's the thing, right? Like, you look around like Singapore or Brazil or whatever else. Chinese EVs are zooming around, and here in America they're not. So,
wrapping up. Given that South Korea, like we mentioned so far, South Korea does share some of the core U.S. interests, but not all. What are the potential conflict points in the next few years?
Yeah. I mean, we've had a wide-ranging discussion that has jumped from
nuclear
focus to
trade
focus, right? And I would come back to that, which is every Korean owner, left and right, likes the United States. I mean, it's not
polls actually show.
Yes, it's not an anti-American thing. It's these are what we care about versus what the Americans care about. And the EVs are, it's just a perfect example of that, right?
It's certainly not 2003 anymore.
No, And so to that extent, there are fundamental agreements. It is a good relationship. And I said this during Roh Moo-hyun administration and things, which is there's an alliance, which is this kind of it's institutional thing. But the relationship is so much broader than that. It's trade, it's families, it's Korean Americans.
Complicated.
Right? It's going to continue no matter what the actual number of troops we have in Korea is. Okay.
Which Trump got wrong, by the way.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. Yeah, but and so that's the fundamental thing to remember is that the relationship is much deeper than the alliance. Both countries share some, but not all relations. And so they're going to want to work towards certain things. But
I'm going to have to push back, though, because you didn't answer the question. What are the potential conflict points that you see?
Well, that's what I was going to get to. But I want to start with that overview, right?
Okay.
And the conflict points, I think, are number one, trade. Absolutely. This is one of the things that happens in D.C. is we've got the security people and then the trade people, and they often operate very differently from each other.
They don't even meet each other in networks.
No, and so the security people are totally focused on war and over Taiwan, and miss the incredibly complicated, deep-standing economic and investment, et cetera, relationships, right? And so that's one is sort of trade and investment. The other one I do think is this sort of Japan pushing thing. I mean, that's as much up to Japan,
come back.
but it's going to come back, right? And third is, especially if there's a progressive administration in South Korea, is North-South relations, right? That doesn't mean the South Korean government is going to go off the reservation and blah, blah, blah and do stuff. But a South Korean government that's progressive would be more interested in engaging than the Yoon administration would be.
Even with the North saying that they have no interest in talking to the South.
Well, we'll
at
see.
all.
We'll see what happens. But you see what I'm saying, right? Like, I don't think the balloon thing would have happened if there was a progressive, because I don't think the balloons would have been going north, And one of my friends somebody said it was like, that's terrorism. The North is doing terrorism by sending
soft
the balloon.
terrorism.
That was
They
Victor
say.
Yeah,
Cha,
right.
actually.
But then, But how does South balloons then count as soft terrorism? Is that different?
Japan also goes back and forth between different administrations, sort of, right?
Well, same party but different factions.
Right. it's
LDP.
So, how does U.S. see Japan going back and forth? Do they?
I think
treat
it's
them
less.
differently?
I think it's less, right?
Same party, just different
Because it's the
strains.
same party. And what happened, though, when the Liberals did lose for a couple years, is the amount of hair pulling and hand wringing in the U.S. was the same as it was in South Korea when the I forget, Democratic Progressive, whatever it was called in Japan for a brief period won and was more open to China and more open to North Korea. In D.C., we got the same type of op-eds about amateur hour and how dare Japan forget, et cetera, et cetera. So they act the same way. The difference is that Japan, in many ways, is an island. It's separated a little bit. North Korea is not its main issue. Even China, Taiwan is not necessarily its main issue. So it can afford to appear more pro-U.S., but it doesn't have to do a lot. And I'll give you one example. The much ballyhooed 2% increase in defense spending in Japan and everything else that they've talked about. Number one, they simply labeled things as defense spending, like pensions. Okay, number one. So it's no actual increase in spending. And number two, what was it last year? They put off raising taxes until 2026 for making any kinds of increase in defense. And we'll see 4 years, 3 years, now it's 2 years from now. When we get to 2026, do they actually do anything? Right? So they talked about it. But then, well, we're not going to do it yet. We're going to put off raising taxes for a couple of years. So it's very It's very good theater.
Also, they
But I
have
haven't
more
seen-
space to do that.
Well, yes, and that's the thing, right? And so they can do that. And so I haven't seen real fundamental shift in Japanese actions in ways that match the words they're telling the United States.
I see. Final thoughts. Any recommendations for U.S. and South Korean administrations or policymakers?
Hey.
As
Start
frank
with a
as
strategy.
possible.
Yeah,
Start
no,
with a strategy.
I mean, if I were king of America, if I were president, right?
Well, it is king now.
I know it is. It's going to be thanks to the Supreme Court. The United States seems to have a focus on everything which is military first. We lead with our chin. And I'm not sure I don't think an enduring solution to North Korea, to Taiwan, to the South, any of these major issues in East Asia are a military solution. There needs to be a diplomatic and economic solution to these problems, right? And so in many ways, yes, that's a component of it. We seem to think that happens first, and then we ignore everything else. And what we see, for example, on the Korean Peninsula is all that the military first deterrence, complete isolation kind of threats and name calling has gotten us is a tragedy. We are in the same place that we were in 1945, literally the same place, right? So, I mean, it's okay on one hand, but as a forward-leaning strategy, and then more largely in terms of economics, I think we're making such a big mistake.
Recommendation to South Korean administration?
That was going to be my question.
Yeah. That's a little harder.
Let's start with the current administration.
Again, I think, the South Korean government shares but doesn't have all. And so in this case, the pushing back on the trade was one where you get a carve-out now, right? You get this exception, right? The Yoon administration has been fairly clear that, what did Park Jin say? Like, there's no Indo-Pacific without China, right? They're not willing to go along even with the rhetoric that the U.S. has had about it containing China. And I think that's important because that's not the way that South Korea is going to navigate its relationships with these countries. Korea is not moving away. You have to live with Japan and China and North Korea and Taiwan and everything else. And so in that sense, I think they're doing a better job than they could be. They could be making a bigger mistake.
And lastly, whoever wins the next South Korean presidential election, who might have to live with the Trump America, what's your recommendation?
pray.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Again, that's so much speculation, right?
Yes.
I mean, I don't know any more about American politics than you. I mean, I happen to live there, but I don't study it. But everything I've seen in the elections, Trump won 2016, but he didn't win 2020. 2018, 2022, there was not the red wave that everyone thought. I think the Dobbs abortion decision has been deeply unpopular, and every time abortion's on the ballot, it wins, even in deeply red states. So no matter what you think about the latest debate and things, I would still rather be the Democrats going into this election than I would the Republicans, because there are some deeply unpopular views and president, which doesn't mean that's Biden's going to win. But Trump is facing more headwinds now than he ever has before.
So pray.
Pray.
I know, right?
All right. Thank you very much
Thanks
for
for
joining
having
us
me.
today.
This is fun. Thank you.
This was very, very fun.
It was.
Thank you.
And this was Korea Pro Podcast special episode. If you want to know more, please subscribe. And that's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in.
If you want to know more, sign up for our daily executive briefings. We brief you on all you need to know from the past 24 hours and why they matter every morning in your inboxes.
Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for your weekly dose of insight. And until next time, I'm Jeongmin Kim.
And I'm John Lay. Stay connected, stay informed, and we'll see you next time on the Korea Pro Podcast.